This conference will now be recorded.
And I wonder if would you take a second and introduce yourself? Just because we like to do this. Some of you heard your talk here at Utah State, but maybe you could remind us who you are and how you got to be one of the deans of water resource management in the Colorado River. And then the deal is that I have asked all of the students to come armed with questions. And so I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's questions and the discussion. But before we start, Eric, how the hell did you end up doing this?
By total accident. My background is I went to the University of New Mexico, studied nuclear engineering, went into the Navy, was in the Navy for 6 years. I was an officer on a nuclear submarine that has been decommissioned many, many years ago. From there, I went back to graduate school, and while I was waiting for a colleague to finish a phone call, I saw an advertisement for the essentially the assistant manager of the Colorado River District in Colorado. I was born in Canada. My dad's a geologist, and then grew up in Flagstaff from about 12 or 13 on. School at New Mexico and in the Navy. So I had zero background in water, but I had some project management background. I just, by lark, I ended up at the Colorado River District in early 1981. From there, I just kind of, was like a sponge. I look at it this way. Picked up all of the stuff that you need to know to be in the business. The district is one of two conservation districts, four conservation districts in Colorado. Utah doesn't have anything like it. We're organized by the legislature around compacts, but we're not a state agency. We have an independent board. And we operate projects, we do water policy, we do in-stream flows. We have a very broad purpose, but we're primarily there because of the Continental Divide. When I say the Colorado River District is there because of the Continental Divide, in 1937, there was a big debate over a project called the Colorado Big Thompson Project. You've probably read about it in that big book that you had, and a little bit in mine. In the debate, the West Slope formed what was called the West Slope Protective Association, which was a group of lawyers and county commissioners and others, ranchers, who didn't want Denver or didn't want the Northeast Colorado. They'd already lost to Denver in an earlier round to take a whole bunch of water without compensation to the West Slope. So when that was all settled by an agreement that became embodied in Senate Document 80, which was the feasibility study, if you want to call it, for the Colorado Big Thompson project. When that was finished, the lawyers and county commissioners that created the West Slope Protective Association knew it wouldn't be the last fight over Trans Mountain diversions. So as a result, in 1937, along with the formation of the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Colorado's Conservancy District Act, there was a package of things that happened that year, and the River District was formed. I started working for them in early 1981. I retired in August of 2018. For the last 22 years or so, I was the general manager. So during that time, like I say, we got involved in lots of interstate issues. I've been on I was listening in, you had a talk with Amy Haas. I've been on the Upper Colorado River Commission Engineering Committee since 1982. So I've been through a lot of the debates over interstate issues. Both internal within Colorado and the big river stuff, I was involved in all of that, including the 2007 interim guidelines, the DCPs, and a bunch of stuff that we all take for granted now, including the Colorado River Endangered Fishes Recovery Program. I was on the original committee in 1984 that negotiated how that program would move forward. So that's sort of my background. You know, and
That's
when
great.
I retired, I
Yeah,
wanted
that's
to put out
great.
a book so I could talk a little bit about, you know, how we use science and how we make decision making on the river.
So with that, students and participants, let's just have a great freewheeling conversation. Don't be bashful. Somebody ask a question.
Eric, I got a question for you. So Jack has been on a video conference roll today, and we got to hear earlier from some folks involved with the 10 Tribes Partnership.
Right.
And
I was on
one of the real,
right. I was on
oh, excellent. Okay, well, we all go to Zoom University now. One of the real themes that stood out with that is that there has been an effort, but now there are some kind of institutional changes happening that are increasing the number of voices at the table. It seems like your career, you've really kind of lived through and seen what that looks like. And I'm wondering if you can kind of reflect on where you think that goes next, and maybe who is currently left out of some of these conversations and how they might be brought in, and kind of where you see kind of the future of this sort of move towards inclusivity, given that there's kind of this history of kind of the good old boys who run the Colorado River, and kind of what does that future look like to you?
Great question, and I think one of the conclusions we have in the book and others is that the river is going to be much more inclusive in the next round of decisions than it has been historically. You know, historically, the river there was a lot of public interest in the development of the river, but the people who actually made the decisions, those who were at the table, those who were negotiating the agreements, and while they included, in many cases, governors and senators and people of high political office, public was generally not involved, but the public was sort of happy with the direction that we were taking. And this is I'd say through the 1940s, 1950s. They've been beginning, as you know, beginning in the 60s and the 70s, we had the environmental movement. And I think from my view, the environmental community got actively involved in the river in the early 1980s with the Endangered Fishes Recovery Program. The management committee of that recovery program had a member from the environmental community on the management committee and the implementation committee. So that was sort of the first step. And the environmental community was there. They've enlarged it as they've gone through. If you've seen right now their contribution to the DCP that was just approved here last year, when there was federal legislation needed to approve it, we had Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, American Rivers. We had the major environmental groups all supporting that legislation. So they've sort of phased in their work. Now, the district I work for, they were there a long time ago because about half our counties are recreation based, those next to the mountain, and about half of the counties, I would say, are extraction and farming based. So there was some tensions in the early 80s, but they ultimately figured out that good water quality in Grand Junction for the farming and good, and rafting in Grand Junction is good, is good. And that benefits the river up and down the river. So that transition has occurred, I think, in the 80s and 90s. We also saw in the early 2000s a lot of other agencies come in. This was usually Department of Interior, but it wasn't that inclusive, and USGS. But when you talked about the Fish and Wildlife Service and others, they were consulted, but they didn't have the role that they have today because of the legal victories they've had in the Endangered Species Act. And unfortunately, I think there's the two groups that are the latest to come to the table are the Indian tribes. Now, in the River District, even though in that district I work for, there are consumptive uses within the district, including Trans Mountain diversions, make up about half of the entire consumptive use in the Upper Basin. we don't have any tribes. So the Upper Basin's tribes are largely an issue in Utah and New Mexico, a little bit in Southwest Colorado, but they solved that a long time ago, and nothing in the River District or Wyoming. But the tribes are sort of the last ones, and the other ones that I think are the last ones to come to the table are the smaller communities and smaller irrigation districts, especially those in the Upper Basin. And when I say that, it's the town of Glenwood Springs and Carbondale. It's the little communities and the smaller irrigation districts. The large districts like Denver Water and the Grand Valley and Uncompahgre and all of the big districts in the lower basin have been there forever. But we're only now seeing some of those smaller irrigation districts and smaller communities get involved in the river.
That's great.
Hi, Eric. My question is somewhat related to Will's. We were talking to Chris Harris the other week from the Colorado River Board of California, and he mentioned that they were really trying to keep imperial irrigation at the table and trying to restore the Salton Sea in order to keep IID at the negotiating table. And I was wondering if there are other parties in the future that you're worried about might leave the table kind of in this brave new world.
Well, and I think Chris's comments about the Imperial Irrigation District and the Salton Sea are really foretelling what is going to be a very difficult issue for us to resolve at the basin. Because while Chris is working to try and keep IID at the table, you have heard people like Pat Mulroy and others say, you know, the solution to the Salton Sea is to pave it. And then they're not being, it's she, you know, when she speaks, she does a little flair, but there is some seriousness to that. And that is that you can't, you know, with water being so scarce, we can't afford to allow those return flows that have maintained the Salton Sea and are now going down in quantity, and thus the sea is getting smaller and causing all the problems. That we can't, you know, because of the conflict over water and the fact that the river is going to be smaller in the future, you know, we just can't. We no longer have the luxury of keeping up a Salton Sea, you know, but that becomes a real problem for the Imperial Irrigation District because their people live next to it. They have to deal with it. They have to deal with the playa. They have to deal with the dust. They have no choice. And you know, paving, while Pat may be joking when she says pave it, the cost of any solution in the Imperial Valley to the Salton Sea is going to be very big, and a question that the states and others have not come to grips with, but we know it's going to be on the table, is it just a California problem, or is it a problem that the entire basin is going to have to address and is going to have to help support? And I think it's the latter. I think that's the reality. And what the Imperial Irrigation District has, its tool is they have some very, very senior water rights. So they have some legal tools that are available to them that they can, if they want to be uncooperative as a tactical matter to get more attention to the Salton Sea, they have the tools to do that.
I have a follow-up question on that. Do you think, you know, as we start trying to conserve water more, paving more irrigation canals and things like that, could the Salton Sea be a precursor to other unintended environmental consequences that we have with trying to make, you know, trying to conserve more water that we don't even know might exist until we do them? And is that things that water managers are thinking about as they try to push people to conserve more water or practice more conservative irrigation and agricultural practices?
Absolutely, and in fact, in the Upper Basin, This is a big deal in Wyoming and Colorado. I don't know that it is caught on in Utah quite as much, but one of the problems with demand management, paying farmers and irrigators to not grow a hay crop, is that if you go to places like the Eagle River or the Roaring Fork River where I live, the Gunnison River, you know, the irrigation has replaced the beavers in terms of maintaining aquifers that maintain late season in-stream flows. When I was at the district, we looked at Eagle County and we looked at some of the streams. In 1977, which is a very dry year, they had some very low flows late season. But in 1977, there were only like 2 golf courses in the county and the basin. And now there are like 20. And a lot of the irrigation has gone away. Now we were seeing dry late season flows in July, August, and September, and high temperatures, which are really bad for the trout fishery and in the stream. We were seeing those in moderately dry years because of the retirement, if you want to call it, or not having as much irrigated agriculture. They're seeing that in the Upper Gunnison as well. They've had a number of studies that have looked at this. And this is very different than in the lower basin, of course. And you might have 4 inches to 6 inches of topsoil in the Gunnison Basin sitting on top of a big alluvial groundwater basin. And if the irrigators keep those late season flows up. And that is a huge political issue on the West Slope. And it's one where the environmental community, for the most part, and the ranchers and the downstream users, at least on the West Slope, are all in accord that you're going to have to keep. We're going to have to keep a careful eye on what things like demand management and additional development do to late season irrigation or late season return flows in the upper reaches of the river.
Hi, Eric. I have 2 questions for you. And the first one is about the competition between lower and upper basin. And we all know 1923 compact gave both upper and lower and basin 7.5 million acre feet. And in reality, upper basin only uses around 5 million, and lower basin uses almost all. And also, lower basin can make a compact call if upper basin doesn't deliver enough water to the lower basin. And by contrast, there's no way to protect our upper basin users and access to all of its 7.5. I personally think it is unfair to the upper states. So my question here is, should upper basin fight for their 7.5 million acre feet, or should they just give up because they don't need that much water? And the second question is very simple, is that from your perspective, we know that upper basin depletion probably won't increase. And do you have any opinions about lower basin depletions in the future? Yeah, thank you.
Well, let me get the last one first. I think lower basin depletions are going down, and they're going to continue to go down. They have to. And I think you've seen that really since 2013, 2014. The upper basin is in a real tough situation because I know that the concern that because the states of the upper division have obligations there at Lee Ferry, 75 million over 10 under the compact, plus half the Mexican treaty. You add that up, that's 82.5 million acre feet every 10 years. Now, neither the treaty nor the compact require any flow in any 1 year. So those are aggregate flows. The question though is if the river is only going to yield, I use rough numbers, 12.5 million acre feet, and you got to deliver 8.25. That means you're delivering 4.25. As you said, our uses can run anywhere from 4.5 to 5, counting evaporation. So you can see we're already in a deficit unless we have some wetter years. So the upper basin is legitimately concerned about the impact of a curtailment under the compact. In some ways, my view, and this is, I'm in a little easier position than folks like Amy Haas, and I listened to Amy's comments. She works for 4 different states that have 4 different opinions and lots of politicians breathing down their neck. I don't. So what I say is that the upper basin needs to play a little hardball with the lower basin about the threat of a curtailment. And the tools it has are that in the lower basin is still using, the compact actually allocated 8.5 to the lower basin, not 7.5. They're using far more than that when you consider main stem reservoir evaporation and lower basin tributaries and all of those kinds of things. So that as we move forward in the negotiations, what the upper basin should be doing is protecting existing uses and basically trying to strike a deal with the lower basin that we on the behind the scenes all know is real. The lower basin is never going to require a compact curtailment other than in theory, because it would trigger litigation, and that litigation would go into those issues like the overuse in the lower basin over 8.5. So it's a house of cards. And the question that I have for the upper basin folks is, are you going to continue to do the, to be a good neighbor and to reach a consensus and to not address that issue? I think you heard Amy say overuse in the lower basin is going to be an issue for them. So there's some room to negotiate. It's what John Fleck and I call a grand bargain. We don't want to say it's got to be this or that, but what we've got to say is at some point in time, what Jim Lockhead and I told the lower basin is, let's agree to exchange the sleeves off our vests. The lower basin will agree they're not going to curtail the upper basin uses as long as our uses remain about what they are today, and we won't address your issues related to tributary and overuse. And we all know that's going to happen some way, informally, but how do you formalize it? And the problems are the politics, because I just noticed, didn't the Utah legislature have some sort of a resolution or something like that saying that that Utah is not using its full compact entitlement and it needs to study taking water from the Green River into the Bear River Basin or something of the sort.
It did. Yeah.
So you have these expectations that are on the upper basin that we're going to continue to use more development. So we've got to come to grips with reality, and hopefully the futures project that Jack and you, John, and others are working on will help us move toward that reality.
I guess the question I have, Eric, building on that is, I think water wranglers put it really well when they talked about the 2 horns that the West Slope finds itself sitting between, the demands of the lower basin and the demands of the East Slope of Colorado. And I think after this morning's conversation, we could almost add a third potential horn for, the native tribes that have very senior and significant. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Did it all freeze?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was just wondering which horn of, is it going to be the lower basin? Is it going to be the East Slope? Is it going to be the tribes that you feel like are going to have to drive that negotiation first? Which horn is going to draw first blood from the West Slope, figuratively speaking?
This is just my prediction, but I would say it's going to be the lower basin. The River District has done a really good job over the years of boxing out the Front Range in terms of new Trans Mountain diversions. It's just not the River District strategy. It was topography. All of the easy to build Trans Mountain diversions have been built, or there are senior rights downstream that keep that water running downstream, like Shoshone or the Aspinall unit and other things. So we've on the Front Range, we've sort of boxed out, or on the West Slope, we've boxed out the Front Range. But the lower basin is moving upstream because the uses in the lower basin, especially for agriculture, might have a greater economic value than they do in the upper basin. So it's inevitable that the lower basin is going to move upstream. So from Western Colorado's perspective, I think it's going to be the lower basin. I think in other states, especially New Mexico, it may be the tribes. You know, and the tribes are in a very difficult situation because, you know, as you heard from Daryl and Matt this morning, you know, they have senior rights, but in order to develop them, it's going to require a lot of money. And where does that money come from? It comes from Congress. And who has to vote in that money? It's got to be the members of the House and Senate from those states. And the tribes have, especially in Arizona, they have zero influence over maybe one member of the House of Representatives that represents the Flagstaff area, but they have no influence in Congress. So there's a little bit of a stalemate right now in terms of the tribes. The reality, they have senior rights, but the reality is they need a lot of money to develop them, and to get that money, they need political support. And why would the CAP support a bill to allow the Navajos to use more Colorado River water right now? Not just the CAP, Phoenix, Tucson, and all the cities that they develop. So that's the dilemma that the tribes have. And I don't know how we get out of it. I have no idea how we get around that.
I had another question about the grand bargain concept that you mentioned in Science Be Damned. You know, and it seems, as you had said, the informal aspect of it might be pretty easy, but to actually get an agreement on paper, it seems it's going to have to be something that's highly dynamic, flexible, and in my limited experience with water resource agreements, like, that's just not really what they're about. They're about black and white sort of things. And so I wonder if you're aware on a smaller scale, potentially like communities or different states that have a model of these more flexible agreements, especially ones that are incorporating an immense amount of uncertainty that we have in the future of what the hydrology and the stream flow will actually look like, that could act as kind of you know, a basic model that could potentially be scaled up for a grand bargain negotiation. Is anybody doing this at all, I guess?
You know, I've thought about that question a lot, and I can't find a good example, because if you go to the adjacent basins like the Rio Grande, I think they're in worse shape. You know, Texas and New Mexico are in court over legitimate uses on the tributary, I mean, in groundwater, tributary groundwater. The Sacramento San Joaquin system is as big a mess, if not a bigger mess, than the Colorado. So when I look for an example of something like that, I don't find it. I know some Colorado scholars have looked at the Murray-Darling system in Australia, but the last I've read is the sort of peace they had between the irrigation and the environmental community sort of broken down in the last drought, which they went into and are now out of. So yeah, that's a good question. It may be that the Colorado River has to sort of be the leader in that, like we've been in other areas. On that, I sort of think that there is a soft landing, and it's a incremental approach that may give the lower basin more access to Lake Powell in terms of how you operate Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And as long as they're managing Lake Powell, then they can't implement a curtailment. That wouldn't require a amendment to the compact. And there would be some advantages to that. I know that the Trans Mountain diverters in Colorado would love that, because they wouldn't have to worry about it. They wouldn't have to worry about a curtailment. And, you know, our Trans Mountain diverters like Colorado Springs, Aurora, Denver, when you export water in Colorado, you can use that to extinction. You can use all the return flows. So when Colorado Springs takes water from the West Slope, they can successively reuse it, and they have developed fairly significant and sophisticated projects to do so. So they want to invest more in reuse, but they're not going, according to Jim Lockhead and others, they're not going to invest more in reuse as long as this threat of a curtailment is there. So I think there is some momentum among the users that has not yet reached the state agencies for a informal approach, sort of an agreement to incrementally move toward a grand bargain without a serious, change to a compact or the law of the river, or the 1956 statutes and all those kinds of things. I think it's very doable personally. And I think it would have some environmental advantages too, because if the lower basin had more of a stake in how I operated Lake Powell, and the upper basin wasn't impacted by that as much, then you wouldn't have to deal with, you would have more flexibility in moving water from Powell to Meade. And with more flexibility in moving water from Powell to Meade, you have more tools, not in all years, but you would have more tools to avoid some of the impacts we want to avoid with respect to temperatures and flows and things like inundating the Pierce Ferry or Pierce Rapid falls. So there's some advantages there. The key is getting some leadership in the basin to actually step out, and lead with their face, if you want to say, and propose it. Now, I will say that historically, the states have been laggers when it comes to proposing these ideas, and it's for political reasons. When we suggested a DCP in 2010 or 11 or 12, the states weren't on board yet, and then it became obvious. They became full supporters of it. So when you're working for a state agency, you kind of want to look to see where the governor and the legislature are before you make your move. So that means they're likely to be the last entities to endorse some of these changes that I think will happen on the river.
Hey, Eric, question for you. As we were reading through A Ditch in Time, it's often presented as sort of this tug of war between the Front Range and the West Slope in terms of water diversions. And yet, at the same time, a lot of the storage that's been developed on the West Slope has come sort of as a compromise because of development on the Front Range. And I'm just wondering, looking back, do you see development and growth of the Denver area as a sort of net benefit for the West Slope, or is it a definite negative in terms of water availability on the West Slope?
It's 50-50. The Colorado Big Thompson project that included Green Mountain
Is Eric frozen for you guys?
Yes.
I've lost
Okay. Everybody's looking like he was still talking. And I was like, maybe it's just
Eric is, so it's Eric's connection that has died. And he doesn't know. Let's all wave at Eric.
Well, he probably does know, but he can't do a lot about it.
Unless he calls in on a phone. But he can't hear us. Well, we got 40 minutes. He is we can't unfreeze him. Eric? So we all can see each other. We're only going to go till 5. Let's hang out for a minute. I will tell you guys, it's Eric is such a thoughtful and innovative guy. It's really a pleasure to listen to him. There are a few people as innovative as him. I wonder if he knows that he probably is given the most articulate answer that anyone could come up, and he doesn't know. Eric?
Yeah, I came back with my phone, so.
Okay, we presume that it was an absolutely awesome answer you just gave, except none of us heard any of it.
So is this the question about the values of the Trans Mountain diversions with mitigation to the west slope?
Is Denver a net benefit or a net detriment to the west slope?
I think that you can make a case that it's a net benefit.
Wow.
Because of the reservoirs that they built that allow us to have better late season stream flows, better irrigation flows, and the reality that what's really good for the Front Range is good for the west slope, the economic connection. And then we have one more subtle but but a very important issue is many people on the Front Range now have second homes and things like that in the headwaters counties, and they are they go to great lengths to preserve their viewshed and their streams.
Hey, Eric, I have a question building on Alan's mentioning of Patty's addition time. I was wondering, Patty tells the trajectory of Denver water and is kind of a hegemon, in Colorado. But then there was this somewhat of a sea change in their approach and their attitude after Two Forks didn't come through, and she really hit on that in her latter chapters. And I realized that that time period also overlaps with your time when you started and then became manager at Colorado Water District. I was wondering if you could just speak to that, if you noticed that change in their approach over time, and then perhaps you did, but maybe the average irrigator in Gunnison, maybe still harbored traditional views towards Denver water or the Front Range. Can you speak to that history a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the average irrigator in the Grand Valley and others were slow to pick up on the Denver issue, and it's kind of a joke on the West Slope that when we're talking about water, Denver is everything from Pueblo to Fort Collins because all of them use water now. Denver Water has a particular projects in a particular service area, but Denver sort of means like when you're Salt Lake City could be everything from Provo, from Provo to Ogden, that we look at it that way. The Denver, it was a very difficult transition for Denver, the Two Forks thing, because Two Forks was big reservoir on the east slope, would pick up a little Platte River yield, but it would also take a whole lot of water from the west slope. About 2/3 of the yield came from the west slope. And they basically took an approach to try to pick off Summit County and the west slope, and that didn't work. When the George H.W. Bush administration vetoed it, I think there was a signal to board members and the mayor and Chip Sperry, who was then a deputy DNR, became the manager, that we needed to change the direction. And once they got there, they embraced that very well. So they sort of made a change very quickly, whereas the rest of the Front Range, many of them haven't changed, and then the West Slope has been slow to understand that. But I think we largely do today, but it wasn't, as I say, it took time.
Eric, let me just follow on that, just to touch on this. We would love, one of the other things that Patricia Limerick sort of turned on their head, is that we would love to imagine that ranchers and agricultural communities are the virtuous and that the cities are the evil stealers of water. You know, Chinatown and the Owens Valley as the prime example. And obviously, the Limerick book tries to stand on its head and sort of portray Denver as the virtuous, and maybe irrigate the West Slope as also betting as much on a hope and a prayer of preserving water for oil shale development and mining and industrial development, and that they were no more virtuous than anyone else. What's your take on all that?
You know, I think that was the case in the 70s and early 80s, that there was a big, when the first oil shale boom and the far West Slope was very much of the case. We need to preserve our agriculture so that Exxon can buy it up when they need to come in, and it was seen as an economic, extraction was seen as the economic salvation, and that was sort of overtaken by the reality that we have today in some of the upper valleys in the Gunnison and the Roaring Fork, that as the recreation economy, the second home economy sort of took over and the extraction stuff sort of died because of the economics of it, that the ranches were seen as much more of a virtue because they kept up in-stream flows, and you could drive between Carbondale and Glenwood Springs and not see and see a ranch or mini ranches and not subdivisions. So there's been a transition there from the 70s and 80s or early 80s to what we have today, where most of the major ranches in this valley that I live in are in conservation easements, and a part of the reason they're in conservation easements is to continue the irrigation so that they can have open spaces and return flows. They actually benefit from it.
I have a related question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to learn from your experience, Eric. For example, in current times, which approach you will prefer, whether the existing demand of water should encourage the further development of waterworks, or we should still keep looking for new waterways and try to provide more opportunities for the population to flow in? Or simply I can ask, like, for a water planning agency, right now, what should be the criteria to say no for the large developments of the city?
Could you summarize that? I had a hard time. I might have lost a little bit of a connection there again. I had a hard time getting that.
I just want to understand, like, in the current time, for a water agency, how or what should be the specific reason they should say no to the development for a large D?
Yeah.
Like,
all right.
Water. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think Moazam is saying, should water agencies say no to new large developments, or should water agencies continue to seek out new sources?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think the traditional role of it, as you might see play out with the Lake Powell pipeline, is that the role of a water agency is to take whatever projections the local governments say and say, my job is to go out and find the water for it. And I think that has been largely the way things were done in Colorado, especially on the Front Range, for a long time, but that is now changing. It's been changing with I think the Two Forks discussion we had changed that, where now it's an economic decision that rather than acquiring more water, the marginal cost of conservation, reuse, and other things are less than new sources. And therefore, we should figure out how to meet our demands with the water supply that we have with a more efficient management of the existing supply. I think that is the predominant view of the major municipalities, but not all of them. You know, and an example of that is examples of that in the lower basin, of course, are Las Vegas, Phoenix, and the Metropolitan Water District. You know, Las Vegas serves another 600,000 more people today with less water than they were using in 2003.
On sort of that same. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead and ask.
I wanted to ask, because we had touched earlier in the semester on the idea of decoupling urban population growth from water demand. Do you think those two are truly decoupled, or are we in sort of a calibration phase where we're developing more efficient ways to use water? Is that an important distinction? Are we going to, run up against limits, and is that going to be something we're going to have to deal with?
You know, I think ultimately we'll run up against limits, and in certain areas we'll run up against limits, but as a basin of a whole, I think we're a long way from that limit. You know, it kind of goes down to the individual providers. Like on the Front Range, I think they have a long way to go before they're going to run up against limits. The problem is you have new communities being developed, and Douglas County, for example, didn't exist in 1960s when Denver developed its Roberts Tunnel system, as a Ditch in Time would talk about. So Douglas County now doesn't have that access to the water because of our water rights system that Denver has. And Denver is not of any mood to share water with them over a number of reasons. So in some communities, because they're new, get locked into, they can't manage a resource until you have a good set of, until you have enough water that you can ultimately reuse it and manage it in other ways. That's what I'm seeing on the Front Range. What I'm seeing on the West Slope is more as development occurs where I live, where most people in Grand Junction live, used to be irrigated agriculture. When you replace irrigated agriculture with subdivisions that have roads and rooftops and things like that, there's a net reduction in consumptive use. And that's pretty well proven through many court cases in Western Colorado, where people show that when they're making a change, that they end up with extra water in the system. So the bottom line is, I would say it's sort of, we're in that calibration period, but a lot of it depends on the local entity.
I have a quick question. We now better know that the importance of using the best data. This is one of the lessons of layer one others. Do you think that we have been successful in providing such kind of data so far?
I think it's going to be a challenge because there's two things that are conflicting there. One is the aspirations that have long been involved in water development versus actual data. And I kind of the view, if I had we're writing my book again, I would go into a little more of game theory in terms of how a lot of these negotiations are very predictable. If you look at the people who study game theory and say that that what they're looking out for is to get enough, they know how much is enough, and they better get more than enough. And that attitude doesn't work well when it for in a basin like the Colorado. So it's going to be a real challenge moving forward to use the actual data, like what's been happening with the upper basin, actual consumptive uses in the upper basin, because that runs afoul of long-held political aspirations. I know Amy Haas is caught in the middle of that when they look at their demand schedule.
Any other questions?
I have one. I don't want to hog the time if anyone else did though. But Eric, I wanted to know you've been on a a book tour since last fall with John Fleck around the basin, and I was just wondering if in these interactions, if you've ever had any feedback from listeners or audiences that surprised you, informed you, or was countered or confrontational to maybe something in the book. How has that experience been, basically?
Well, a lot of it was truncated by COVID, so much of my schedule is ended. There has been some pushback, I would say, from the idea that we weren't using the best science, and we never used the best. The politics of the day overrode the best science. And I think there were, some folks like at the Colorado River Water Users Association didn't want to hear that. So there were some folks that said, yeah, that may be true, but did you have to put it down on paper? Got a little bit of that. But for the most part, the feedback has been very positive. It's been, this is a story we didn't understand, and I'm glad you put it on paper.
Eric, since it's 5 o'clock, do you want to leave us? Some of you may have seen the latest issue of National Geographic, which has 2 covers: the world from a pessimist standpoint perspective and the future from an optimist standpoint. I'm not sure what the rosy analog is. The depressing analog or metaphor is the water knife. Is the water knife scenario inevitable for the Colorado River? Do you think we're going to dodge this bullet and everything is going to come out just fine?
I am actually an optimist, and that's kind of where we were in the last 2 chapters of the book, because I think that, John Fleck has the saying that we'll figure out how to use the amount of water nature gives. We'll provide, and even when it's going down, we're going to figure out how. And when I look at what Las Vegas has done, when I look at what Metropolitan Water District has done, when I look at what Denver has done, and when I look at the reality of why people are moving to the West Slope, it's not for irrigation. It's not for extractive industries. And I think that's going to be true in Utah, a big part of Utah as well, that there's enough water to go around. I think there's going to be some challenges getting there, but my general view of it is in 30, 40, 50 years, we're going to have less water because that's what climate change does. We're going to have some interesting fights to get there, but the people that we're still going to have, it's still going to be a great place to be, and that's kind of my rosy message, if you want to call it. Not quite not quite half. I don't look at it as half full, but I look at it as having a bright future with less water.
Well, so long as Los Angeles and other senior water rights in the lower basin persist in their senior rights, it could be a great time to be a fisherman in the upper basin, because it means a lot of water is going to go be in the streams going downstream.
Yeah, I think that was the lesson of water wranglers. I think that was one of Frank Delaney's comments, was if the water's going to California, we can go fishing in it on its way.
Anybody else have any last questions? Anybody dying to ask something? Eric, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
This is Zach. I have a fish question. I'll start with, Eric, are you familiar with the larval trigger study plan, fish releases from Flaming Gorge?
Yes, generally familiar, not in detail.
Okay. So what do you think is the feasibility of a similar flow for the Colorado, say near Moab, coming out of coordinated releases from small impoundments?
You know, it's going to be harder. In the upper basin, we have a coordinated reservoir operations effort that includes like weekly calls. You know, there's the where we try to be as flexible as possible to operate Rudai, Williams Fork, Green Mountain, Wolford Mountain, some of the reservoirs we built. That has done, you know, it's considered successful. There's the Fish and Wildlife Service really likes it. They control a lot of water. And the problem is the farther you go downstream from these reservoirs, the more difficult it is because the small size of the reservoirs. You know, Flaming Gorge is 4 million acre feet, has a lot of capacity. The reservoirs that we have upstream might amount to 200,000 acre feet of capacity on a 2 million acre foot river in Glenwood Springs. You know, so it's possible. It's just going to be a little more difficult because of the size of the storage versus the size of the.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks,
right.
Jack, for inviting me. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, let's thank Eric, and thank you very much, Eric. It's been a great conversation. It's been an honor to read your book. Congratulations on the book, and mostly thanks for making a difference. It's a life well lived to continue to make as much of a difference as you do, and it's inspiring to students to see that. So thank you very much, and to everybody. I don't want to do a Zoom class again, but let's hope we can all sit in my backyard and have a beer and talk about stuff that matters. You guys are all great, and I'll miss you, and take care. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Be safe.